Okay. Well, thanks, Julie, for introducing the webinar start. For those that have not attended before, I will have a brief introduction of my background. But first, thank you for those that are joining us tonight. And I'm just trying to work the technical side of things again. So I have a background in animal and equine science with a specialization in equine nutrition and behavior. Here is a picture of one of my last trial, which was for my PhD, which is looking at the influence of odor, taste, and nutrients on diet selection, and we published that paper last year. And yeah, it was kind of a bit of a memory game, and you see me here taking the movement of horses. So that's kind of my my last work. But before that, I finished my undergraduate studies, and I continued with a master, which focused much more on the effect of dietary transition from pasture to grain feeding, and vice versa on the gut health of horses, and the onset of hindgut acidosis and laminitis. So it was more on gut microbiology, and in a previous webinar we focused on laminitis. Now I'm kind of much more in the behavioral side and consulting side. So after my master's, I moved to Australia, where I founded MBA Equine Services. And it's kind of a combination between offering education such as this webinar and workshops on site, but I also like to still be involved with research and offering specialized consultancy services for private horse owners, but also businesses that are either interested in equine nutrition or property designing, so environmental consulting, so a bit of a combination between property designing and pasture management. And on the sideline, I'm also involved as an EA coach and an EA official in dressage judging. But I have another hat on, so I have many hats on, but equine permaculture is kind of part of the property and pasture consulting. And equine permaculture, it was an initiative that developed because I looked at different farming strategies that I felt that would really benefit pasture health, soil health, and obviously would work with nature rather than against nature, and would benefit the horse. And so I use many strategies, farming strategies, so it's not only permaculture, but I felt that that is kind of the foundation because it has soil health as kind of fundamental, and they use a lot of techniques that really benefit property design and pasture management. But you will also hear me talking about holistic management, key line design, and behavioral education, using animal behavior for grazing, for weed management, as well as grazing management. As our equine permaculture is pretty much like a website where we offer articles, so blog stories. Either they're from articles from magazines that are already written, or I add as I go some topics. So those are free for people to read, and I will give our website and also our Facebook page a little bit later. And I hope, and I've been saying this many webinars, that we set up an online course for equine permaculture. But I think first we'll need to develop some manuals and some books, and I think that's the start of the online course, having material that we can use for building the course. And so this year I'm focusing on building or compiling the fodder tree and shrub book for horse owners. So it will be an international guide, but I will talk about that a little bit later, and give you also the Facebook pages to stay in touch with any of updates and developments in that area. Okay, so we're going to talk about weed management or weeds in general, and how we can manage it. So one of the first things I want to do is, it kind of continues from a previous webinar on pasture as a pharmacy for horses. And in that webinar I highlighted that there are many vegetation that our horses can graze and browse on. So we have our grasses, we have our legumes, we have our shrubs, and we have our trees. And they can ingest depending on their, what they have available in the pasture. But if you look at free-roaming horses, they will have a large intake of both, of grasses and browse, depending also on the season. But it's kind of a bit of a 90 to 10%, so 90% grazing and 10% browsing in general year-round, and that may shift to almost 50% browsing and 50% grazing, depending on the region, availability, and the climate. And we discussed that all of these plants have compounds. So we talk about plant primary compounds, which are the nutrients. That is, those are like proteins, carbohydrates, fats, minerals, and vitamins that the horse will need to eat daily to maintain cell function, for growth, for lactation, depending on the class of the horse. And so obviously any of the vegetation is a nutrient source, but also what you can find in vegetation, and again depending if you're dealing with grasses or with browse, you will find plant secondary compounds or metabolites, and these are what we call the toxins, and that is something that we go into more detail about in this webinar. So alkaloids, tannins, saponins, they are all plant secondary compounds that the horse may also ingest as part of those plant primary compounds while it's searching for protein or carbohydrates. It may also ingest these plant secondary compounds. I will get back to this and explain a little bit more what that entails. And then additionally, horses may also select different types of vegetation purely based on flavor, on a hedonic value. So similar to us, based on smell or taste or texture, they may have certain preferences. So that's what we talked about in brief in the pastures pharmacy, and specifically looking at self-supplementation and why horses do that, and how plant compounds play a role in that. So plant secondary compounds are produced by the plant, but they don't aid in the growth or development of the plant. So they are kind of produced mainly to protect the plant for predation, so herbivory, so avoiding overgrazing from depending on where they are adapted to. So for instance, our native pastures here in Australia are adapted to herbivory from marsupials, and if you look at Africa, it's more like your ungulate, so your large grazing and browsing species. And so they are either for protecting the plant from overeating, but it can also be that the plant have these secondary compounds to protect them from UV radiation. It could also be used to attract pollinators. So it has many functions for the plant, but it is not necessarily directly beneficial for their growth and development of the plant. So it is an extra investment that the plant is doing. There are many compounds that we have identified, but still there's a lot that we have not measured or analyzed, and I think that is also why it's very interesting in botany and also in medicine to look at all these different compounds, because they may have some medicinal purposes as well. I mean, a lot of our medicine is based on plant compounds, these secondary compounds. They are used, so they are built from the primary metabolism, so they use amino acids or carbohydrates to build these molecules. So this is just a bit of chemistry. So that's how plant secondary compounds are made in the plant. So it's very important to be aware of that that all plants contain toxins. And most of these toxins limit the intake and cause animals to eat a variety of foods. So that's why we see animals, or particularly if we just observe our horses, moving away from certain grass plants and then they start browsing, or they may eat some legumes and they switch. That is either due to nutrients or toxins or flavor. So obviously, unless the horse tells us, we don't know. But we know that toxins limit the intake. So they, even if it's palatable or it has a good flavor and good carbohydrates, they may not eat a lot because the toxins may cause nausea, and that is a sign for the animal to, or it may become too bitter and they may move away from that plant for a while. But there is a small portion, so all plants contain toxins, but there is a small portion that we can call poisonous, and those are the ones that in small dosage are typically toxic or poisonous for all animals and also humans. So those are things that we need to be very cautious of, and we can only know that by looking into literature, being aware of weeds or plants in your garden, so your ornamental plants as well as your pasture plants and your weeds. So you need to be quite aware of these types of plants that are in the poisonous corner that we may have to avoid at all times. But if you think about grasses, a lot of people think that toxins are only in weeds, but that's not true. Toxins can be found in grasses, and I just have here a list. Not for you to memorize or anything like that, but I just wanted to show you that we have many secondary compounds, so toxins in grasses, and some of those you may encounter. So for instance, ryegrass has alkaloids. For instance, Johnson grass has nitrates. Most plants have silica, which is in the cell wall of plants, which makes it very abrasive, but horses are very well adapted to deal with silica due to their molars, and that helps with their wear and tear. So it's not always bad, so it's not necessarily that these are always bad. Condensed tannins, you find them in many types of grasses, but also in browse, and I will get back to these tannins, because while we classify them as toxins, as secondary compounds, it doesn't mean they're always bad. They can actually be really beneficial for the grazing animals. So condensed tannins can, for instance, be very helpful with reducing parasite burden in grazing animals. But for instance, phenolics and alkaloids, and in particular your cyanogenic glycosates, they can be quite toxic for, in large quantities, quite toxic for grazing herbivores. Saponins, you find that for instance in lucerne. So there are a wide variety, and they are there in your pasture. So, but there is indeed some of these that can have a negative effect on horses, and I have here the three main ones that we're dealing with in for horses, but also livestock, which are for instance oxalates or tannins. They may actually reduce some of the mineral absorption, so that can cause mineral deficiency. So for instance, oxalates can bind calcium and causes hypocalcemia, and can lead to big head in horses. So that is mainly for those horses grazing oxalate based pasture. So these are typically found in tropical species. But we'll get back to this, because oxalate can also be found in some forms of weeds. Protease inhibitors, these just inhibit protein absorption. So for instance, soybean, not that you find that on pasture, but it's something that we may feed to livestock. That needs to be either heated or to help with breaking down this trypsin inhibitor, so that protein does come available for the horse. Lupins have the same. So you may not find these typically in your pastures, but you can find these in your legumes that we may feed as a concentrate to horses. So that's why heat treatment of concentrates is very important, like your protein legume sources, and soy and lupins are one of those that are often fed to horses. There are also pastures and weeds that can cause a neurological, particular more probably legumes, that can cause neurological disturbance or liver damage, either through alkaloids or glycosides, and this is probably one of the main ones besides mineral deficiency, liver damage, neurological disturbance, and as well as lung problems. Those are probably the major group that you find that have that causes or negative side effects that you may encounter due to plant toxins. But I also want to highlight, and this was in our previous, we already kind of discussed this, that it's not all bad. So plant toxins have also a medicinal use, and obviously, for instance, if you think about willow, we actually isolated aspirin from that. So those are things that we are now daily using as a medicine. So it's not always bad, these secondary compounds. They can actually have a bit of a good use in small dosage, I have to say, though. So for instance, I already discussed this, condensed tannins and saponins can have an antiparasitic properties. This is particularly studied now due to the worm resistancy to wormers. So moving away from our insomactins and looking at other ways how we can, reduce some of the worm burden. And more, well, they have done in vitro studies on this. They need to do, there's one in vivo study that they've done in France, and more research has to be done to look at the effects in horses, but they found some very promising work, very promising work in sheep. So we need to do more on this, but that's a very good use using secondary compounds. Antioxidant properties. These are obviously, for instance, in your lucerne, that can help with free radicals and metabolites, and have also vitamins in there, which can be used for the horse. There are also certain types of plants or bark or leaves that have anti-diabetic or insulin-like properties. So, for instance, I already talked about different spices and herbs. So here you have, for instance, your cinnamon. Not all types of cinnamon, though. There is a very specific species that show more promise and have been studied in humans and rats, and they can have these insulin-like properties. So those are very interesting for those people that are dealing with, that are managing horses with metabolic issues. Okay, so we talked about plant toxins, but there are some other compounds that we need to be quite aware of. So you have the compounds that are bound in the plant. So those are the ones that I highlighted in the slide that you saw with the grasses. That are some of the main groups. But we have also mycotoxins, which could be which can be released by fungi. And they can actually be in endophytes on the grass. So a lot of people think it's the grass that can cause toxicity, but it's actually the fungus that produces spores that have these mycotoxins. So fungus is a very important category of toxins, and there are over 300 species of fungi that can contaminate our crops or our grasses. So it's a wide problem. But also in spoilage, like for instance, if you have large hay bales, mold spores can be formed, and they can cause obviously some health problems for horses. So and it's very important that not only one species may produce many different types of mycotoxins, and there are several species that may produce the same mycotoxins. And they are capable of causing this disease and even death both in humans and in animals. So we need to be quite cautious about these spores. There are a couple of groups, and this is not all. I just want to show you 6. But there are only 3 major fungi species that are kind of that we mainly deal with when we're making hay, like for instance haylage and silage. There's a large problem if it spoils, then we get these different fungi that grow and that can release spores and release mycotoxins. So those are aflatoxins. That's one that we also find in foodstuffs, like in concentrates, particularly for livestock and horses. So there's quite a bit of, in the EU, there's quite a bit of regulation on how much of these aflatoxins can be in the food. Aspergillus is one of those species. The other one is penicillium, and obviously, as the word is saying, I mean, that's where we isolated penicillin from. So it has, again, a beneficial effect because it's antibacterial, and we've been using it as an antibiotic. But in large quantities or specific species can actually cause health problems. So Aspergillus and penicillium are two of those species that can cause some of the problems in for instance, in hay and silage. But also, again, penicillium, we use that as well, and Aspergillus as well in food production. So we can actually make cheese of it, and sake and miso and soy sauce. So again, there's beneficial use for fungi, but there's also that damaging effect on humans and animals if we have certain types or the quantities. The ones that you may be quite familiar with, and that's what we're going to talk about in more detail, are ergot alkaloids. So these are complex compounds produced by fungi that live on grasses. So I will show another picture how this fungi grows on grass, on the grass seed, and how this may affect, for instance, ryegrass, fescue, and paspalum. And again, I will talk about the effects in a separate slide on that. The other one that, again, we have different types. Patulin is a toxin, but the other one, besides the aflatoxins, the ergot alkaloids, Fusarium toxins, which are produced by many species of Fusarium species. This one is a major problem in silage, particularly when in corn silage and corn cobs, which is not as much here in Australia, but a big problem in America, where they do feed quite a bit of corn silage and stuff like that. But you may find this again in like your haylage and your silage. We on pastures here in Australia, if you don't feed a lot of silage or obviously spoiled hay, in pastures and in weeds, we mainly deal with ergot alkaloids. But a lot of these species may also just grow in the soil, so they don't necessarily have to be on the pasture. They can actually grow in the soil and cause problems as well, respiratory problems So endophyte life cycle. So the endophyte is a fungus. For instance, if we take ryegrass, it just it's kind of grows on the seed of the grass, and when a seed germinates and starts to develop shoots, it actually just kind of grows with it, and it's kind of initially found at the base of the plant, but as it grows and as it gets into the boot stage, when it develops a seed head, that's when it grows up into the seeds, and that's why a lot of these endophytes are causing mainly a problem when the grass is in the flowering stage. So, for instance, for your ryegrass and your fescue, it will be in spring. So it's cool climate grasses, and for instance for paspalum, which is your tropical pasture, they typically flower around summer. So for instance, end of summer, we have now, for instance, seed heads of paspalum. However, not a lot of grass species have endophytes, because we have been able to select species that are endophyte free, and this was probably a problem back in the day when we first started importing these species into Australia from either stock from America or from Europe. and we've obviously been breeding species and selecting species that are endophyte free. But it may still occur, for instance, in your cool climate areas. Ryegrass staggers may be one of those problems. There are 4 primary mycotoxicosis in livestock associated with fungal infection, and they're all from the same family, but they are obviously different species that may be involved. So the major ones that you may be dealing with or may be aware of are, for instance, your fescue toxicosis, and they are from a fungus that are found in tall fescue grasses. But again, there are a lot of seed companies that have tall fescue that is endophyte free. So if you're having pastures with fescue, it may be a problem if they were established already there, but if it's sown quite recently, you will probably don't find as much problem with endophytes. So again, these endophyte fungus, they produce an ergot alkaloid, and they can form different problems in the horse, a bit similar to ryegrass staggers. So ryegrass staggers, it's important to note there are actually 2 types of toxins that may be involved with this disorder, which are both produced by the fungus, but one is a toxin that is not an ergot alkaloid, and then the other one is an ergot alkaloid. So there's actually a mixture. So with ryegrass staggers, it's a bit of a combination. And paspalum staggers, again, it's an alkaloid. It's a different type of alkaloid, but also produced by a fungus in this type of species. And toxicity has been reported in ruminants and in horses, but it's mainly because paspalum is a C4, a tropical grass. It's mainly been seen in Queensland. So your ryegrass staggers and your fescue toxicity or fescue-associated oedema, which is caused by the same species, has been recently described in Australia in horses grazing these pastures species. So those are the main ones that we may encounter. But again, even with ryegrass, a lot of species are endophyte, are selected and bred to have to be endophyte free. But again, it depends on the establishment of your pasture and also the soil conditions, because fungus does live in the soil and may infestate grasses. We'll come back to some of the signs of these problems. But ryegrass staggers causes muscle problems, and like you will find that the horse has this very staggered gait. Same thing with paspalum. Annual ryegrass toxicity is another one that people may confuse, but that is not produced by a fungus, but by a toxin. So that's the third group of toxins that we may be dealing with when we're dealing with weeds or pasture species. So I'm just going, because I'm talking about annual ryegrass, to kind of link to the ryegrass staggers, because a lot of people may, because there's similar signs. So for instance, it causes neurological disturbance and this high stepping gaits and this uncoordinated walk, and as well as convulsions in very extreme cases when it's high, when they had ingested high quantities of these either bacteria toxin or fungi toxin. So it's similar. It actually shows similar signs, But with annual ryegrass, it's caused by a toxin produced by the Clavibacter toxicus, and that is living on a nematode that may affect then your annual ryegrass. So it's slightly a different organism that causes this toxin, but it has similar signs. So that's why I wanted to show. That's why I wanted to show this one, because it kind of shows similar signs as perennial ryegrass stegus, or Paspalum stegus has also kind of similar clinical signs. The other one that we may have to be aware of is Clostridium species, which can cause botulism in horses, which is this paralysis. So you see here a photo of a horse affected by botulism, and that can happen again. It's much more related to feeding large bales of hay and haylage and silage. So this bacteria can produce if the hay or the haylage or the silage has not been produced in its optimum methods and didn't undergo correct fermentation, then and it may be too wet typically, and then we see this bacteria develop. But this bacteria may also enter because it's been accumulating in ducks or like birds, like a dead bird that may have been rolled up in your bale. That's a common problem, for instance, in Europe. And in Europe, particularly in the UK, this species may also live in the soil and have been, or they suggest that it may be linked to equine grass sickness, but there are many other theories how this disease may develop. So botulism is probably more of a problem if you deal with like wet climate, or if you deal with spoilage of bales, like large haylage or silage bales. And again, we don't feed this a lot, so this seems to be much more of a problem in the northern hemisphere. But botulism has been seen in a group of horses, for instance, in Queensland, so where it is a bit more humid climate. So those are the main species, the main toxins that we may encounter in our pasture, so our legumes or our weeds or our pasture species, our grass species. And so these are, just to sum up, these are the secondary compounds that are produced by the plant itself, or it can be due to a endophyte fungus that may inhabit your grass seeds, or it may live in the soil, so fungi that may live in the soil, or it may be due to your hay spoilage or haylage. And you have your third group, which are your bacteria. So your bacteria can also produce toxins that may, particularly that annual ryegrass is an example, that may cause also neurological or toxicity problems in horses. So what I want to do now, obviously I'm not an expert in plants. I'm just kind of put all this information together to give the bigger picture of why we do certain things in pasture management, or what things do we need to be aware of. But what I did is I selected a couple of poisonous species or toxic weeds that you may have encountered, or in your region you may be aware of. But first of all, obviously each property is different, and you may have different species, and so it's a little bit about finding the right information. So obviously your local land care and NRM organizations can be of tremendous help. They will know about local weed problems. They can give advice about control. They may do specific workshops. You can also send in samples if you're not sure what you're dealing with. You may be able to send in samples or drop samples, and typically they identify this either free or for a very small fee. DPI can also have on state level, they may have information and fact sheets on weed identification. They can have really good pictures, so you can check those resources. And there is not a lot of books available, I have to say, probably much more in the northern hemisphere. So England has probably much more detailed catalog or encyclopedia about pasture or plant species that may be toxic or poisonous to livestock and particular horses. In Australia, we have the rule, the RURDIC publication on plants poisonous to horses, an Australian field guide. It has some good information. However, you can only download it. You can download it online for free, but the picture, so the resolution is not really good. So it is sometimes hard to see the species photo. So you still need to use the botanical name and then do a Google search to find correct information and the correct photos that goes with it to kind of get a high resolution photo. But they give some information about identification, so looking at the stem, looking at the leaves, looking at the florets, the petals, the color, those type of information. They talk about ornamental trees, they talk about pasture species, and then your weed species. So, however, there's some limited information about photo tree or trees and shrub species. And so I do feel that we need to have a more comprehensive book. So again, it makes me motivated to get this photo tree list out, because we also in this book want to highlight some of the poisonous trees that we may not want to have on typically around the pastures, that may be in an ornamental garden, but you may not want to have those in your pasture. So we want to focus on the good things about having photo trees, but we also want to give more information about some of the tree species that we want to avoid. So that is kind of some parts of some resources and some organizations that you can contact to get more information. And I know that Horse SA does some local workshops as well with NRM on particular on properties and bringing in your weeds and identifying those at these workshops. So if you're interested in those, I for sure think that Julie can give you information about that. So some of the species that I want to discuss is Patterson Curse, and I think that many may be quite aware of this plant species. It has this very typical purple flower, and you can see here like a pasture full of it. It's also called Salvation Jane, and it's a short-lived winter annual and biannual that grows up to 90 centimeters in height. The seeds can easily be spread to new areas to water runoff and contaminants of transport of hay and grains, and also through animal and vehicle movement. The seeds usually germinate following a rain in summer or in autumn, so that's when they really start to establish, and the flowers occur in early spring. So that's kind of the time where you will see these purple flowers appear. It is a problem mainly in pasture species, or in pastures that are very degraded, that are affected by overgrazing, drought, and fire. So it is really an identification species that highlights that pretty much nothing can grow there. It's typically compacted, and this species just fills a niche. It can grow in these very poor conditions, and it protects itself by accumulating a lot of different types of toxin, of alkaloids, and all parts of this plant are toxic. And even if it's in dried form, and it can cause severe liver damage. It can, to a smaller extent, also cause nitrate poisoning. But that may occur certainly within 2 to 3 weeks of ingesting with a little prior evidence of illness. And the clinical signs may include a mild change in behavior, where the horse may become a little bit more quieter, a change in feeding behavior. So that's why it's always important to observe your horse, look at its normal feeding behavior so that you can pick up on these changes. So it will eat less or being more selective. It can also show respiratory distress, fluid buildup around the abdomen. Obviously, a lot of different signs may be expressed by different horses, because it depends on their sensitivity, like us humans. The toxin, when they do post-mortems on these horses, typically they find that the liver is enlarged and shows hemorrhaging. So it really affects, it really causes severe liver damage. And as the toxin, so the liver function will be affected. So you can actually, if you suspect your horse that it's just kind of not showing fully its normal behavior, and you're maybe finding some of these species, you can actually do a liver test that will typically pick up on this liver problem. So mainly just taking the horse off these pastures, and veterinarian treatment is obviously advised. But again, having horses in pastures like these here on the photo is causing trouble. So removing horses of these kind of infested pastures is obviously common sense. But even if there is a bit of a small area in your pasture, you may be able to fence that off, maybe able to move your horses to a new area. And obviously pasture management, such as slashing and long-term management, and that's something we're going to talk collectively about, because there's a lot of species of weeds that grow under similar conditions when the pasture is really degraded and is just, you know, not having topsoil and not having enough competition of pasture species. The other one that you may be aware of or you have dealt with is flatweed, which is native to Europe. It is highly competitive in pastures, and again, it's found in these degraded pastures, and during drought conditions, it definitely spreads very rapidly when drought breaks and you get a little bit of this flush of rain. It is particular notes, well, you can really identify them because they look a little bit like a dandelion. That's why it's also called false dandelion or cat's ear. It is an upright perennial that grows up to 80 centimeters, and it has these, daisy-like yellow flowers, so they can be easily identified. They are weeds in gardens and pastures, and you can find them on the roadside as well. And flatweed has been linked to Australian stringhalt, and the weed smooth flatweed and dandelion may also be associated with Australian stringhalt. So smooth flatweed is another variety that looks a bit similar, and it has also been linked to the development of Australian stringhalt. So there may be not only flatweed, but there may be also particular environmental factors that grow soil fungus that may also be also involved in Australian stringhalt. So it's still largely unknown if it's potentially a toxin in the flatweed, or may it be that a soil fungus that is associated around when this plant is growing or during environmental conditions of these degraded pastures may cause a problem. So a little bit of flatweed is not a problem, but when they start to rapidly grow and really dominate the pasture, it's typically because the soil is really degraded. And that's when we see soil being stressed and can cause more potentially more pathogens like fungus that may be more harmful or that may release more mycotoxins due to being stressed as well. So we typically see that when the environment is stressed, that these either fungus or secondary compounds are made or in higher quantities. The other one, so I will get back to a little bit more information about Australian Stringhalt, but capeweed is the other one that has been linked to Australian Stringhalt. It is also, so it originates from South Africa, from the Cape Province. That's why it's also called Cape Dandelion or Cape Marigold. And it is actually a plant in the sunflower family. So that's, yeah, kind of, well, it doesn't really look like a sunflower, but it has the similar, little bit similar color. It is also it can be a perennial or an annual plant, and it is a creeper, so it actually sends out stolons, and it definitely grows in pastures that are quite compacted. So again, you see it in very degraded pastures because they can grow on top of the soil. They can really spread very quickly. They don't necessarily need to have very deep tap roots to multiply different more plants. Flowering occurs in late spring and early summer. So again, when the temperature rises and when we get that rain, we see larger quantities may establish in pasture. So stock deaths have been recorded following grazing of capeweed infested pasture. However, toxic levels of nitrate are only likely to be present in plants growing in high fertile soil. So it can accumulate these nitrate, but it seems to be not the main problem in toxicity. It seems to be another toxin in the plant that may be linked, for instance, to Australian Stringhalt. But that's another way where stock can be infected. So it's not a very common problem, but it may happen. And yeah, what we see is that laminitis may also be a problem. So some people have kind of observed either causing Stringhalt, but some horses may even develop laminitis as well, which may just be caused by an inflammatory response. Like toxins may cause this inflammation in the body, which may then, if horses have been already exposed to laminitis, these toxins may actually trigger a laminitic response. I don't know if horses that have no laminitis, that never had laminitis in their life, if they have been exposed to capeweed, if they get laminitis. But it seems that that the horse already had either little bouts or subclinical or clinical, and with these toxins, it may cause this inflammatory response. Similar, we see the same with corticosteroids. Some of the drugs that we may use can also cause laminitis in horses. And we spoke about this in our previous webinar about what are the main causes of laminitis. So stock poison by capeweed exhibits symptoms such as abdominal pains, difficulty breathing, and it may lead to death in some cases. But horses develop skin allergies to the pollen if they come in contact with it while grazing or eating the weed. So skin problem is another one that capeweed may cause. So flatweed and capeweed. So what is Australian Stringhalt? It is really a clinical condition where the horse has involuntary flexion and delayed extension of the hocks. You can see here a clear picture where you see this kind of this flexion of the hind lip, and it's when they're walking, particularly when they're turning or backing, you can really see this type of behavior. They can even touch their belly when they're walking. It's typically found in the hind limbs, but may also occasionally affect the forelimbs. And if I'm correct, there are some from a local vet or from a vet, some videos that show some of this, horses with Stringhalt. And if I'm correct, Julie may be able to send a link about some of those videos so you can see it in action, what the gait of the horse is. Some may actually show this bunny hop gait. What it does, it is really this contraction of the muscles in the hind legs. And one of the, well, how can we, when you suspect your horse having it, first of all, remove it from that paddock to a free weed, an area that is free of flatweeds and other suspected weed. You may want to put it in a sacrifice area where you can feed it hay for a while so that you can check up on the horse. Magnesium chloride is typically administered, so it's a soluble magnesium that is absorbed in the body very rapidly, has a high absorption rate, and that may help with relaxing some of the muscle cramping. But in severe cases that may not work, and you may need to have more veterinary attention. There may even be a drug, phenyltone, that may be administered, and that may help with the recovery. The average recovery time is up to 18 months, so average between 6 and 12 months. But it may also be a couple of days if you just obviously caught on to it very, very early. In very severe cases, surgical treatment, veterinarians may suggest surgical treatments to either cut the tendon or to release some of that, that contraction. But I would say that is in very extreme cases. Soursob is something that probably very growing of concern differently in the southern states, including South Australia. It is native to South Africa. It is a long-lived herbaceous plant, so it has this kind of small. It's kind of reasonably small, 15 to 30 centimeters tall, and it has these kind of yellow type of flowers. And what is very problematic about this one is that it contains quite high amounts of oxalic acid, which accumulates in large quantities when the plant is during environmental stress. So again, we find these in degraded paddocks. They really flourish when there is a drought and then you get some rain. Those are dangerous times. And this oxalic acid is very toxic in large quantities. Remember that one of the first slides where I talked about mineral deficiencies? Well, oxalic acid is also the one that oxalates that you find in some of these tropical grasses. But the amount that this type of plant can accumulate is much higher than what we see in grass plants, because that's more of a chronic mineral deficiency of calcium. But this type of plant can really rapidly lead to acute hypocalcemia, tetany, and severe renal damage. And in South Australia, it is classified as a class 3 declared weed as an agricultural weed, and the species is required to be controlled in parts of the state only. So again, your local NRM may be able to help you identify those areas. But even if it's not, declared in your area of the states, it's something that you really want to avoid having in your pastures, particularly if it becomes a monoculture. When animals do consume large quantities, the effect typically involves death in several weeks with symptoms suggesting chronic oxalate poisoning. Yeah, if you catch up on it early, you will find, again, similar symptoms that the horse may show different feeding behavior, may show lethargic, may show abdominal pain or even colic signs. But yeah, it can go very rapidly, and you may find your horse just lying in the paddock, and you may need obviously a veterinarian attention is required, because to relieve this hypocalcemia, you need to have a intravenous calcium needs to be administered to help with the blood calcium. And some of the renal damage may be sometimes quite severe. So definitely look out for this one, and definitely avoid grazing in areas where you may find large quantities of these, and may have to put horses in like sacrifice areas. We'll get back to how do we manage these type of species. Many of these species show that they live in a more acidic soil. So again, that highlights that the soil may not be optimal. And of course, these are all pioneer species. They grow in certain conditions where no pasture species, may grow. So it's not optimal for your bulk of your preferred pasture species. Okay, so fireweed is native to, again, it's an African species. A lot of these weeds come from Africa. Fireweed is declared noxious weed in Queensland, New South Wales, ACT, WA, and if I'm correct, also in South Australia in certain parts. It has rapidly spread in Australia, particularly in the past 30 years, and it can cause a significant problem for farmers. It has also this yellow type of flower. It's 10 to 15 centimeters tall, and the flower occurs in late autumn. So, but maybe through early summer till late summer. So, kind of around now, you may find these type of species. This plant contains an alkaloid that can cause liver damage. So this is the same type that you may find in your Patterson Curse as well. So it's the same compound, so the same toxic compound, secondary compound that you find in Patterson Curse. So again, it causes similar symptoms, and it may cause this liver damage. So you want to avoid grazing horses on pasture infested with large amounts of fireweed. Also, you want to check your batches of hay and chaff, because they may be found in that as well. So when you buy hay, it's always good to just check, particularly for flowering plants and weeds that may be present. You find it probably much more in your hay than when you get a lucerne hay. But it depends also where it's been harvested. We'll talk about what we else can do on the management a little bit later on. So hemlock is maybe not as known in South Australia, but it is a noxious weed in Victoria, New South Wales, and WA. It is rarely grazed, but I wanted to highlight this one because it's highly poisonous to all species, including humans, and it contains a different type of alkaloid, and it causes severe nerve damage, and it's very uncommon that horses actually graze, because it's the flower, well, all parts, but definitely the flower is the toxic part, but they rarely graze it. So the main danger is mainly that it's through contamination of hay and chaffs and other feedstuffs, and has been pretty particular problem in Europe, so in hays in Europe. So I just wanted to highlight this one, but this type of alkaloid is rapidly absorbed in the gut and in the bloodstream, and have long-lasting depression of the nerve system, so you will see neurological disturbance. But again, it's just to highlight some of these very highly poisonous one. As I said, if you think about that big green circle, the diagram that I showed you, that all plants contain toxin, and that little red circle in the middle, which some are poisonous, this is the one that you want to remember. And then the last one, just to show some other ways how toxins may affect the horse, or horses, or grazing animals, is, for instance, Johns Wort. It is extremely invasive and competes strongly with native vegetation and pasture. And in well-established infestation can largely eliminate all other plants, and it can really dominate pastures. It is a weed. It's originally from Europe, North Africa, and Asia, and it's a weed in 21 countries. So it is not a well-liked species. It is also you can also find it in South Australia, large areas in New South Wales and Victoria. And what is particular about this one is that it has a secondary compound called hypericin, which can cause photosensitization in sheep, cattle, and horses. So you see here, which I took from the internet, a horse that is affected contact with St. Johns Wort. So this, so what it does is this compound is absorbed into the bloodstream, and when it's on the skin surface, so it is inside the skin and in the blood. When it comes in direct sunlight, in direct contact with sunlight, it can cause these clinical signs like sunburn, as you can see here. So all the blistering and the scaling of the skin, particularly on the whites. You can even find it on the legs, particularly if you have wide legs, like horses with wide legs. So your chestnuts or your white horses may be more affected from it. So in these levels, these toxin level seem to decrease as flowers are lost. So it is particular during the flowering stage that that plant have this high amounts of toxins. So so you may want to be quite cautious when it's in flowering. And these levels reach a minimum, so they're quite low in the year from late July to late August. So and then the cycle starts again with spring. So it rises in spring, obviously, with the new season of flowering and shoots, and it decreases as it matures, and then when it dies, and then it starts all over again if we not get rid of it. So that's oh, I have another one. Sorry, that's more for our tropical region. So this one may not be really found in South Australia, but I still wanted to highlight crofton wheat and mistflower because it is a quite poisonous plant, because it can cause lung problems. So it can actually cause chronic lung disease. So when horses are continuously exposed to this type of plant, they can actually develop fibrosis, so all this scar tissue in the lungs, and it really obviously produces a cough in horses, and they're not able to tolerate exercise. So it is not one that you want if you're dealing with, you know, sport horses, and obviously even pleasure horses if you want to ride. So it can be quite damaging because it causes permanent damage that is irreversible. And it was named Namamba horse sickness in New South Wales and Telebudgera horse disease in Queensland. So those kind of northern New South Wales and Queensland deal much more with this type of weed. So the top picture is the crofton wheat, and then kind of from the similar family is mistflower, has kind of a similar type of flower. So they look a lot similar. But these may not be yet in South Australia, but just want to highlight some of the different weeds that have different health effects. So this one is really causing lung damage, where most of the ones that we highlighted have a liver damage or a neurological, or can cause neurological disturbance. And then with St. Johns Wort, it causes this this sensitivity to sunlight due to the toxin that circulates in the bloodstream. Okay, and then we finish off with some weed management. So obviously there's so many other weeds that you may be dealing with, and or you may deal much more with these endophyte problems or fungi problems, not necessarily on the pasture plant, but it may be in your soil. So those things depending on your property, on your soil condition, your geographical location, you may obviously deal with different species. And I obviously don't have the time to go through all of them, and it will be also very boring. So I already gave you some of the references, and definitely Julie will be will follow up with an email where we provide some links to the NRM information and some fact sheets, as well as the RERDIC. We'll also put up the RERDIC link. But I want to finish off, obviously, well, what can we do to, well, prevent or avoid as much as possible these types of weeds? And we already talked about that most of these grow in a degraded soil that is overgrazed, compacted, is in stress. And there are other things that may cause higher amounts of secondary compounds or mycotoxins in your soil. Obviously, when the pasture is stressed, so nutrient deficiency, fertilizing with NPK, so high amounts of NPK can actually aggravate some of the, can actually make plants produce more secondary compounds. pH, so either an alkaline soil or an acidic soil seems to favor some of these species. Most of the ones that I showed in this presentation like an acidic soil, so as soon as you change the pH, they are less likely to establish. So adding minerals, drought, we already highlighted that drought is a big problem that causes, so again, that's water stress, which may provide a niche for these species to establish, because they have low water requirements versus pasture have high water requirements. High or low temperatures, salinity, UV stress, pathogen infections, so those are like your nematodes, and again with annual ryegrass, those nematodes may then carry this fungus, so you want to avoid diseases in your pasture or in your soil. Compaction and overgrazing we already highlighted. So some of the least toxic weed management is, well, obviously trying to remove, first you want to remove your horses from your pasture. Avoid grazing horses on pasture infected with any of the weeds that we highlighted, or other ones that you have identified that may be a problem to their health. So one of the first things that we can do, if it's only a couple and you can manage it, individual plants can be pulled out by hand or spot sprayed by selective herbicide. You can even make your own. But to get advice about what has been successful and what is allowed, because you may have production farms besides you that don't allow you to use herbicide, I would suggest that you contact your NRM or your land care organizations to get some advice about specific herbicide use, spot spraying for the type of weeds. Remove plants in the early growing stages for best result, and ensure that all parts of the plants are removed from the ground if you do pull weeds by hand. You need to make sure that that either if you have a composting facility, that you can either compost them. Hot composting is needed to get the best result to really decompose the weeds, and also to kill any weed seeds. If they are very invasive and you don't have good composting facilities, then it's best to get rid of them by removing them and bring them to a landfill, or where you can get rid of pasture species. And again, your local authorities, the NRM and land care organizations may be able to help you where you could go, because typically landfill, it will end up in landfill, but there may be specific facilities that put it in a fermenting. They can actually put it in a digester and actually ferment it, so it is really broken down and gas is produced. So yeah, definitely check that out. The use of herbicides on larger infestation is only effective if the plant is in small seedlings in early flowering stage, but I would not really spray out the whole paddock, because what happens is that your pasture, your soil health will also, and all your soil workers will be affected by it, and you actually will find that by degrading the soil more with a herbicide, and particular repeated use of herbicides will actually make the soil more susceptible to have weeds. So actually by using herbicides on large quantities, you're actually selecting weeds, if that makes sense. So you need to think about soil development, more biological control. Burning weeds with a torch may also be useful, obviously not during very dry conditions. So again, there's only maybe a certain window that you can do this, but burning torches have been used if you cannot use herbicides. Slashing of weeds, obviously before it sets flower or seed, can be very helpful, and at the same time it will help you build soil. But for long-term management, you really need to think about building healthy soils and more rich soils where weeds are outcompeted by your pasture species. So it's all about what we call succession in plant establishment. So if you're dealing with compaction problems, you may have to, well, slashing and mulching can be both very useful, but it's kind of a slower process to decompact soils. You can use key lining or deep ripping techniques to fast track your decompaction. It helps with allowing oxygen to come in. It helps with water infiltration. At the same time, you can plant your more desirable pasture species. Composting, obviously, if you are on a carbon deficient, if you don't have enough topsoil, you need to add more organic matter, compost, mulching, obviously slashing. All of that will help with building soil to create a medium where your pasture species can dominate rather than your weed species, which are typically on your subsoil because topsoil is already stripped and is highly compacted. Soil additives, so you can either think about your pH. So if you are having acidic soils, you may be able to add some lime, or if it's alkaline, you may need to make some changes using composting to get the right balance of pH, which is more optimal for your pasture species and your legume species. Biostimulant to help with your good microbes in the soil to get them kick-started. And obviously minimize grazing pressure on infested pasture to maintain a good ground cover year-round and prevent weeds from establishing in these bare patches. So grazing planning is very important. So don't graze below 45 centimeters. So allow enough leaf area for the pasture to recover. And we do that by rotational grazing or cell grazing, HM grazing, and moving animals through the landscape to avoid this going below this 45 centimeters. For tropical pastures, you don't want to go below 8 to 10 centimeters. So having paddocks, having enough paddocks to rotate your horses through is very important. So the more paddocks, the more you can allow for recovery time of pastures. Strip grazing, so if you don't have enough pastures, you can create them, you know, like you don't necessarily need to think about investing in permanent infrastructure. Just using tape allows you, or is enough to just set off an area and then move the animal away from that area to a new cell or a new paddock, and allowing the area that has been grazed to rest. And at the same time, when it's resting, you can then do your management. Look at indeed at some of the long-term pasture management strategies, such as decompacting, mulching, slashing, all those kind of things that may be needed in those areas. That allows you to work on those areas. In the case that you just don't have enough pasture, we've already been talking a lot about this, is that we have, you know, areas where we can take the animals off. So central point systems and laneway systems may be very useful to help with maintaining grass cover and avoiding this overgrazing. Obviously, still provide enough forage, so typically we've been talking about slow feeding systems and allowing the animals still to forage and get enough fiber maintain gut health, as well as maintain their feed, for their welfare and their feeding behavior. And in summary, just a couple of other, just not only related to weeds but also to pasture, and I've been highlighting this so many times. It's all about biodiversity. I don't mind having some weeds. I have weeds in my pastures, and I know it's a compaction problem, and we're working on it. So half our pastures are doing really well, and the other part we will be key lining this coming season to help with that problem in certain areas. Again, I cell graze the horses, and once they're out of there, I do slashing, I do composting, I do mulching, whatever is needed in that area. Obviously, horses will always congregate in certain spots, and that's where I need to use a bit of spot mulching and things like that. But for me, it's all about reducing monoculture. So I don't mind a little bit of weed species, legumes, anything that can grow I'm happy with, because I will be slashing that, and hopefully the next season I will be able to decompact the soils and actually get more of my favorable grass species. Reducing high oxalate species, that's mainly more of a problem in your tropical, subtropical regions. So Queensland is dealing way more with oxalate species than, for instance, South Australia, although you do have also C4 species. Obviously, reduce weed species, I would say that if it's a monoculture, you definitely need to do some action. And if you have really of these toxic, poisonous ones, you may have to remove them as well. And it's all about having ground cover and also having enough vegetation for the animal to choose from, so that it's not forced to eat these weeds that are dominating the pasture. So typically toxicosis in horses, or toxicity in horses, are typically in relation to when there's not enough pasture availability, and they have nothing to choose from. So having choice, having enough pasture availability is very important. And if you don't have enough, then thinking about the sacrifice areas and supplementing the horse, obviously, with enough fiber. And for those that need extra protein and energy, that can help as well with and minerals and vitamins. Having a good nutritional plane will help with toxin intake. So if a horse has a good nutritional profile, is on a good nutritional plane, has enough protein, has enough energy, it can actually help. It can actually deal much better with toxins. So it actually has a higher level. It has a higher tolerance of toxin intake, and it also can break it down a bit better. But when horses are stressed nutritionally and the soil is stressed, that's when we really see horses obviously being more exposed to weed species that can cause toxicity problems in horses. Well, that's all I had to say. So again, I'm not a pasture specialist or a weed specialist, but I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. We have actually equine permaculture booklet where I talk about C3 grasses, so your temperate grasses, your C4 grasses. I do talk about some of the toxicity problems in there, but we hope to have upcoming this year working on a photo tree booklet, as I said, that highlights the benefits of trees, but also highlighting some of these species that we want to avoid due to this toxin problem. And for more events, I will leave you to Julie.
Thank you very much, Mary.